This week on Q&A, our guest is Ellis Cose, contributing editor and columnist for Newsweek magazine. He's also producer of Against the Odds, a radio documentary series about people overcoming adversity.
Ellis Cose, back on March 14, 1994, you wrote the following. Writers necessarily believe that words are magical, capable of illuminating even the most cobwebbed minds. But to write about race for an interracial audience is to sorely test one's faith in that notion. You remember writing that?
I do. It was in the aftermath, as I recall, of the O.J. Simpson imbroglio. And I think that remains to be true today. Even though we have a black or interracial president, even though we've made tremendous strides in just those 14 years or 15 years since then, we still have a very different way, characteristically, of coming to these issues depending on our racial background.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
One current example, we've seen this dust up over Skip Gates and the policeman, the Sergeant Crowley, who arrested him. His initial response, the president's initial response, was to call the policeman stupid, in effect. To respond sort of angrily. On 1 out of 5 whites, only 1 out of 5 whites thought that was an appropriate reaction. Only 1 out of 5 whites liked that reaction. Close to over 3/4 of blacks liked that reaction and agreed with it. That's just one example of many you could cite where if there's an issue that impinges on race in this society, we do tend to look at it quite differently, and I think it's a consequence of our different histories and different sets of experiences.
How many years have you been with Newsweek?
Newsweek, 15 years now.
Who was the first person you can remember that asked you to write about race?
That would be, that would actually be college. I began writing professionally when I was 18, actually, but I began college when I was 17. And before I got my job with the Chicago Sun-Times, which was my first real writing job, I was editing a publication at my university, the University of Illinois in Chicago. And that we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, those were times when race was very much an issue. And we were dealing with issues of race. We were dealing with the assassination, or the killing at least, of one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, which was big news in Chicago. We were dealing with turmoil in the streets, in the aftermath of the King assassination. We're dealing with all these kinds of issues. We're dealing with riots, which tore up the community in which I grew up, both in 1966 and in 1968. So my writing about race at that time came out of what was the big story of the age, and which happened to coincide with my coming of age.
Exactly where in Chicago did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in the west side of Chicago in a group of housing projects called Henry Horner Homes. This weekend, actually, or last week, I should say, I was in California. An old friend of mine, this is a guy named Verdine White, who was the bass player now for Earth, Wind & Fire and was one of the founding members of Earth, Wind & Fire. And we both came up in the same neighborhood, and we were sort of reminiscing about growing up on that part of the west side in that era.
What was it like there?
Well, in one sense, it was like any childhood. I mean, we weren't aware that those were, we were aware they were the projects, but we weren't aware that that was bad. And for us, I mean, Sonia Sotomayor, for instance, talks, the current Supreme Court, most recent Supreme Court appointee, talks about moving to the projects in the Bronx as a step up. I mean, for us, when we moved to the projects, it was a step up. It was a bigger place. It was a nicer place than we had been before. But compared to people who had it really well, and we certainly learned that as we got older, it wasn't such a great place, and it was a place where violence was more normal than was healthy for kids coming up, and it was a pretty tough area.
So what got you to the point where somebody thought you could write about this racial issue?
Well, before people thought I could write about a racial issue, I guess I first had to get people to think that I could write. And that came about in a number of ways, but if I really have to trace it, it comes about most directly from my experience with high school English. I hated English in high school. I hated the assignments. I thought they were boring. I thought they were uncreative. And I always had a hard time with my English teachers. I was excelling in math and having a hard time in English because I just refused to do the work. Because I always tested well, I was in one of the best high schools in the city. I was in a school called Lane Technical, which is not in my neighborhood. It was way on the north side. And I remember having this, I won't exactly call it a confrontation, but this discussion with my senior English teacher, a woman named Mrs. Klinger. And she calls me up at the end of the class and tells me, Ellis, you're obviously a very bright guy. The work you've done is wonderful, but you're not doing the work in our class. Why not? And I said, well, I'm not doing the work in this class because the work is boring. I said, so much of the work consists of answering stupid questions at the end of the chapter of a book to prove you've read the preceding chapter. I know I've read it. I know what these questions are about, and I don't want to waste my time doing that. And she, sort of in exasperation, said, well, what is it that you propose to do? And I thought for a second. I said, well, the purpose of this class is to determine my ability to research and to write. Isn't that correct? Well, she said, well, more or less. I said, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you let me write? I'll write something for you. And she said, well, you'll write what? I said, well, why don't I write a research paper? I'll write a paper on the history of riots in America, and the riots were on my mind because my community, as I mentioned, had been torn up by riots in the aftermath of the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King. And she said, fine, write about riots in America. So for the first time, Brian, for the first time in my life, I actually got turned on by English and researched riots from the 20s, researched riots overseas, researched the history of riots in the country, went to spent hours in the library, and came back and wrote a 140-page manuscript, as I recall. And Mrs. Klinger took this manuscript home, and she was a sort of diminutive white woman. She takes this manuscript home. She comes back after the weekend and calls me up. And she says, Ellis, I'm going to tell you what. So I'm going to give you an A in this course. Said, but I'm really not capable of judging this material. You need to send this to a professional. And I pause and I look at her. I said, well, what do you mean, a professional what? I don't know any professionals. And she said, well, have you ever heard of a woman called Gwendolyn Brooks? I said, well, yeah, I heard of Gwendolyn Brooks. She's a poet. She's a poet laureate. She said, well, send it to her and see what she thinks. So we got an address at the university where Gwendolyn Brooks was teaching, and I sent Gwendolyn Brooks this 140-page manuscript on riots throughout history, essentially. And didn't hear anything for, I guess, weeks. And one Saturday, I get this call. I'm living at home, of course, and it's Gwendolyn Brooks. And she says, Ellis, you have to come down and talk with me. And actually it was up, I guess, because she was teaching at a university called Northeastern in Chicago. So I take 3 buses, as I recall, and go see this great woman, not knowing what to expect, and find my way into her office. And there's this very warm, just gentle woman who has my manuscript in front of her, and she pushes it towards me. And what she has done, she's underlined all kinds of things in it, and she's written across the top in both blue and red ink, Ellis, one day you will be a great writer. As you can imagine, that was just tremendous validation for a kid who came from my circumstances. And that was sort of what planted the idea in my head she actually planted the idea in my head that I should be writing as a profession. She said to me during our conversation, Ellis, I don't know what you plan to do with your life, but you are a writer. You should be a writer. As I said, I came from the projects. I didn't know professionals. I didn't know writers. The idea of being a writer was just something that hadn't occurred to me. And once she planted the seed, I became obsessed with it. And I was this, as you can probably guess, a fairly intense young man. And I began to write. Within a period of, I think, a year, I produced two more manuscripts. One was a novel. One was another work of nonfiction, which is now lost to memory and history. And by the time I got to college, which I just entered college when I was 17, by the time I got to college, I had pretty much decided, even though I was a psychology major, that I really was going to be a writer.
Have you, well, first of all, is Mrs. Klinger still alive?
No, she's not.
Did you ever go back to her after you became a success and talk to her about what happened?
No, I didn't, unfortunately, and I've come to regret that.
And what about Gwendolyn Brooks? Is she still alive?
Gwendolyn Brooks has also died, but Gwendolyn Brooks actually became one of several mentors that I had in my life. She invited me to join her writers group, and at that time she had a very active writers group in Chicago, and I did, and I went to several meetings, but you also have to recall I was 17 at the time. Actually, I think I may have been 16 at the time when we had our encounter. And for me, meeting with a group of old people meaning people in their late 20s and 30s, wasn't quite working. So I dropped out of her group, but we stayed in touch.
Recently, and we're going to run an excerpt in a moment from I heard you on a radio documentary, and just talking to you now, it comes to mind that you, for somebody that deals with this highly tense relationship between blacks and whites and different kinds of people, you talk very quietly. Do you realize that?
I think I'm calm for the most part, and I think it's probably because I think of myself as an even-tempered, sort of rational person, but I think also, these subjects tend to be inherently volatile, and I don't think you need to raise your voice and make them even more volatile.
Do you ever raise your voice?
Oh, of course, I get angry, like everyone gets angry at times.
But I notice even in your radio voice is very quiet. And let's go on to this documentary, and it was a documentary. I listened to the whole thing on the radio. I just found it just going through the dial about Allison and Catherine Bellow.
Yeah.
Tell us about, first of all, what is this series all about?
It's a series called Against the Odds, and it looks at an issue that's always fascinating, which is an issue of social mobility in essence, which is how do people who have terrible sort of beginnings in some sense, how do people who don't have very much achieve something of interest and significance? And we did a pilot last year with a young Somali guy who fled Somalia when the war broke out in the early 90s as a kid, ended up in a refugee camp in Kenya called Dadaab, and managed to, in this camp where there was only a sort of rinkety-dink school that they had put up, managed to get one of the highest scores in the country on his high school completion exams in English, even though English was not his first language, and managed to get himself from there. This guy is living in a one-room shack with no electricity, no plumbing, with his family, manages to get himself from there into Princeton University. And I said, this is just an interesting story. And so we told his story, and this year we decided we're going to do 4. So we have 4 documentaries, some of them based in the United States, some of them based overseas.
Now, we have some video of, is it Abbas Hassan Muhammad?
Abbas Hassan Muhammad, exactly.
And you did that last year.
That was last year's documentary.
And who are you doing these documentaries for?
This is a public radio series, so it's distributed by Public Radio International, and it airs on public radio stations across the country. Can
you get it on for, a podcast, or do you have to be there when they run it on the radio?
Actually, it's not on podcast now, but you can stream it from my website, which is elliscose.com. We have all the videos and all of the audio documentaries up on the website itself.
Well, let's show some of this video. And who shot the video, and for what purpose, by the way? Was it used on television anywhere?
We are using some of it on television, but it's primarily to be used for the web. And we just thought that, and we shot the video, my team. The actual videographer was Jason Dean, who's my assistant and videographer. But we thought that it just made sense, since we were doing the audio, to do video as well.
Here it's called the Ivy League Refugee.
Right.
Let's watch about a minute and a half of it.
He was raised in one of the world's most barren refugee camps, without running water, without electricity, with the most primitive educational system imaginable.
Our home was made of the plastic sheet provided by the UN that covers a few twigs that have been joined together using ropes, and people sleep on a mat which is laid on the ground.
Abbas's father set up a kiosk in the market selling sugar, tea, vegetables, whatever he could get his hands on.
at night you can't move out of your houses because bandits, or what they call shifters, roaming around trying to prey on people.
One night, the shifters came.
My family was raided by 3 bandits. They came at 7 p.m. and pointed gun at everyone, ordering everyone to lie flat on his chest on the ground.
One of the gunmen told Abbas, "I already killed your father and mother. I will kill you if you don't tell me where the money is."
They came in and flashed a light on my face and then dragged me from bed and threw me on the ground, kicking me, punching me.
The family's loss amounted to about $90. The experience confirmed a key lesson for Hassan Muhammad. Life without freedom was unremittingly harsh, and freedom for someone like him only came through education.
So where was that shot that we were looking at right there?
Most of those scenes were shot in Kenya, in the refugee camp called Dadaab, which is on the border near Somalia. It's just an amazing place in many respects, and it's amazing that someone like Abbas, who's just an extraordinary young man, came out of that place. As you can see, it's totally impoverished. It's basically in the desert. And this young man, in order to study, managed to get a rechargeable lamp from CARE, which ran the facility. And every day he would walk a couple of kilometers, over a mile, to recharge this lamp in the CARE facility, and then walk back to his home so he could study at night. The interesting side or footnote to this is that as a result of the work that we did with Abbas and with the documentary, he now has a literary agent who's interested in telling his life story. So we would probably have a book coming out of him in the next couple of years.
How did he get to Princeton?
He got to Princeton because a visiting professor at Princeton happened to be passing through the refugee camp and had heard that their school, their little one-room school, was actually doing some pretty interesting things. And almost on a whim, he said, well, let's get some materials to a couple of these students and have them apply. And so Abbas had never heard of Princeton. He just knew it was he heard there was of it, but he thought it was just some university somewhere in the United States. So he goes on the internet, which he has to go to one of the international aid agencies to get access to, does some research to find out what Princeton is. He applies to it. He had to take he took his first plane trip, which is to Nairobi, is to take the SAT, in order to study, in order to complete his application. Had the people who knew him, including his schoolmasters from Uganda, write letters of recommendation, and shortly thereafter, he gets this fat envelope, he did not have mail service or a phone, so the envelope is delivered to the CARE office. And the director of the CARE office ends up transporting himself to Abbas's home and leaving a message to have Abbas come and see him. So Abbas goes to retrieve this big envelope, and of course, they celebrate and find out he's been admitted into Princeton. And when he got to Princeton, coming from that set of circumstances, Princeton was literally like a different corner of the world. He called his dorm room luxurious, and it was compared to where he came from. And the first time he went into the dining hall in Princeton, he sees all this food and all of this plenty, and he concludes they must be having a special celebration because that's when they bring out food where he comes from. So it was an interesting adjustment for him that he's made quite well.
Where is he right now?
He's actually just finished up his last year at Princeton, and he is, I think, taking the summer off and doing some work, and then we'll be going, I'm pretty sure, to graduate school after that.
Here's some more from your video and your conversation.
In 2003, Abbas Hassan Muhammad took the exam for the Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education. He ranked first in the northeastern province of Kenya and 8th in the entire country. A professor visiting from Princeton thought he might be Ivy League material.
This professor, he sent us Princeton application forms. I've never heard of Princeton then. I just knew it was just a school in the US, and that was all.
I thought this was wackery, which is diagnostic of the problem. I think institutionally, we don't think of these things as really possible.
You can't imagine my joy when I read the fact that I was was given admission and full financial aid.
You know, he was absorbing everything. That's what I sensed right away, is that he was a little bit in awe maybe of the surroundings. He was definitely friendly and very grateful. Right away, actually struck me as somebody who was, I had a great feeling about, as somebody who was going to be okay.
I've enjoyed my stay at Princeton University for the last 2 years. It opens so many doors for me, so many opportunities. I'm here to empower myself with education so that I can go back home and make a difference.
Do you think he'll go back home?
There's not much of a home to go back to. As you know, Somalia has been a mess for over a decade now. Home, in large measure for him, is a refugee camp where he grew up, and that's no place to go back to. I would suspect he's going to stay in the United States for a while.
Who paid for his education?
Well, he got a full scholarship. You know, he had absolutely no money, and he also worked study. I mean, he worked 2 and 3 jobs when he was in school. He had no money to get here. He ended up borrowing the money from someone who worked for USAID, because they were so impressed with this young man and with the opportunity that he had before him, that this woman actually put on a personal credit card, put the cost of his airplane ticket on it.
As a man who started out writing for a living, how did you get into audio and video?
I have been sort of dabbling in audio because I was doing commentary for NPR for some shows for them, and I basically decided, why not, if you're in for a dime, in for a dollar, why not actually start producing some? And it started really with a set of conversations with some people at the Ford Foundation who said, you know, we're willing to give you some funding if you have something interesting you want to do with this. And so they funded the initial documentary, and with the last set, we have several funders who came in, you know, including the Daniel and Joanna Rose Fund, the Atlantic Philanthropies, Goldman Sachs Fund, you know, and Ford as well.
What's your goal?
I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. I mean, my goal, in one sense, is to tell stories, which is what I do, which is what we do. My other goal, though, is to explore a theme that's fascinated me since I was a kid growing up in the projects, and that's that whole idea of what is it that enables some people to get out, some people to succeed, some people to do well, and others in similar circumstances who don't. And that's part of why it's against the odds. It's a look at people who have persevered and done something. But it's also sort of reflects another interest that I've always had, which is in allowing people who don't normally get on national news, you know, a chance to tell their stories. You know, someone like a kid from a refugee camp, or someone like the 2 young ladies you spoke of earlier who came out of foster care are not typically the focus of big-time news organizations. And it was important to me to give some people like that a chance to tell their story.
What's the Hope on a Pile of Bones story about?
Hope on a Pile of Bones is the story of, or at least one set of stories, about Rwanda and the rebirth of Rwanda after the terrible genocide of 1994. We tell the story, or I tell the story, from the perspective of several people who are really trying to do something great. I mean, they're trying to rebuild this country. There's John Rushahana, who is an Anglican bishop, and he was actually living in Uganda when the genocide occurred. And he was so taken by it, as the whole world was, that he immediately went back. He at the time was living in Uganda, visiting America on a missionary trip of some sort, on a mission of some sort. He goes back to Uganda, gathers up a group of ministers on a bus, and drives them into Rwanda. And they come across just these horrific scenes, some of which have been seen, of course, by the national audience. And he ultimately decided that what he needed to do was to move back to Rwanda and become part of the rebuilding process. And so he started a boarding school which is now one of the best schools in the country, and it was primarily aimed at orphans of the genocide. He also has a ministry that works in the prisons with people who were perpetrators, and he has a village that he set up that brings perpetrators and victims together and essentially models living in harmony.
Here's a small excerpt from that special.
I'm Ellis Cose. I met Anglican Bishop John Rushahana in Rwanda, but he was in America when violence ripped apart his homeland, and he saw the slaughter as a summons to come home.
I needed to see what was going on personally. I didn't want anybody to tell me. I needed to see it myself firsthand. We saw mass graves, we saw dead bodies. Actually, in one home, we found 27 dead bodies, including a cat and a dog among the human dead bodies.
Rushahana returned to Rwanda to live in 1996, and he threw himself to the task of building a boarding school.
My school is actually a result of the agony that I had in my heart. Having lost 1 million people, lots of babies were abandoned and were left behind.
That school, called Sunrise, opened in 2001. It's now one of the best schools in the country.
What year was the massacre?
In 1994.
He used the figure 1 million.
The figure's in dispute because no one's ever actually cataloged the entire magnitude of the death. The common figure that's used is 800,000, which is a count that the United Nations came up with, but no one really knows how many people were killed there. There are hundreds of thousands of graves, tens of thousands of mass graves, people who were literally tossed into rivers and left. So no one really knows. But the country is a small country. I mean, it's roughly 8 million people. So however you figure it, a huge proportion, perhaps 1 in 10, perhaps 1 in 8, but a huge proportion of this population, died in that massacre. And
how long did you spend there?
Well, I made a few trips there. Most of the taping for the documentary we did over a period of a little bit more than a week in the country.
Do you have any better insight today than you did before you got there and why this happened?
In some sense, I think that goes into that group of just inexplicable things. And in another sense, is clearly what is explicable. I mean, there have been ethnic tensions for years. The Belgians had fostered that, in their part in the way that they decided to divide up leadership in the country. Going back to '59, there have been sort of mass slaughters that have occurred. So there's a long history of this. And then the government at the time, which was a Hutu-led government, decided to make a campaign out of vilifying the Tutsis. And so you had all these awful radio broadcasts, all of these other things, basically telling people that the Tutsis were cockroaches, the Tutsis were out to destroy the country, the Tutsis were trying to undermine the presidency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had this event where the president was assassinated, which was the event that actually touched off the violence in Rwanda.
Out of the 8 million, how many were Hutus and how many were Tutsis?
The Hutus are definitely the majority, and so by far I don't have the exact number in my head. But
this next clip is hard to believe, and I want you to explain it. Let's run this.
Building a school was not enough. The bishop also built a village run by Pastor Deo Gashagaza, where victims and perpetrators of the genocide live side by side. 2 residents, Jeanette and Matthias, victim and perpetrator, explained to me how it works.
My name is Sendegia Matthias. I was jailed in 1994 because I killed the Tutsis. I ask forgiveness for those I killed and everything that I did, but this was with the help of Pastor Gashagaza and the Pastor Gahigi, because they keep on coming in jail to teach us, and so we can ask forgiveness.
How do you feel standing next to a man like this man who killed people during the genocide.
It was very difficult, but now I forgive him, and so we live together like good neighbors. Their children come to the house and eat, and even my children can go to his house and get some food as well. I forgive him.
How can that be?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible not to talk to these people, and it's hard not to be emotionally affected when you see this. They come from a place of religion. The bishop has made it a point to basically tell them that a Christian life demands that they have the capacity to forgive, and they've taken that seriously. And so I think also in the country, not just in this village that he's set up, there is this sense that we need to get beyond what happened in 1994. The country needs to move on. And I think those two impulses you see coming together in this little village, where they end up just forming human relationships ultimately. And the woman says, I mean, she accepts him as her friend, and he, of course, expresses his own remorse, for what he's done, and that's the model the bishop is trying to start. I mean, I should say that you still have lots of tension, in that country. You still have, I mean, I visited when I was there. I visited one of the prisons. Prisoners who were, held 15 years after the occurrence on the crimes of genocide, who refused to admit they had participated in anything, and all of them claimed they were innocent. I visited the Kigali Memorial during one visit there, actually a previous visit to when we did this taping, which is the memorial to the genocide. Myself and a Rwandan journalist talked to the guard. We go into the facility. We're in there maybe a minute, and there's this awful explosion. And we come out a little bit later and discover that the guard to whom we had been talking had been killed by a grenade that someone had tossed at the facility while we were inside. So you still see signs of the tension there, but there are certainly lots of people who are trying very hard to get beyond that.
Let's go on to the story that I mentioned earlier of the Bellow sisters. We don't have video on that, we have audio. Set it up for us so we can
Well, these are
the
two sisters, Catherine and Ellison Bellew, who were essentially abandoned by their parents. Their parents were both alcoholics. The father was a drug addict. The mother, their parents split at one point. The mother received custody of them. She was incapable of taking care of them, and she decides to take off. At this point, they were living in California. She decides to take off with a boyfriend, leaves them in a house where the electricity gets turned off, no phone. The father shows up. He takes custody of them. He ends up, as I said, being a drunk and a drug addict. He can't take care of them. They ultimately end up with an aunt who subsequently commits suicide, and they get plunged into the foster care system at the ages of, I think it was 11 and 10 respectively.
How'd you find them?
Found them through a set of networks. I mean, once I decided that we were going to do these sets of stories, I just put out word that we were looking for people who had interesting stories of overcoming adversity to tell.
What's the race of this family?
These two girls are both white.
And are they actual sisters, or are they just foster, where they'd end up in the same foster home?
They're actual sisters, or I guess I should say they're half-sisters since they have a different father, but they're actually sisters.
Here's just a minute and 21 seconds of part of their story.
One day, rummaging through their aunt's purse, they found a gun.
We asked her, we're like, oh, why do you have a gun in your purse? We had never known anybody, even living on an army base, ever carried a gun. And she said, oh, it's for protection. And so we didn't think twice about it.
Until later that summer, when Allison stumbled on a scene that would stay with her for life. Aunt Noelle had barricaded herself in a closet, and the uncle was talking to her through the locked door.
And he was trying to break it down, but he didn't want to hurt her, and he didn't want to scare us. They were talking very hurriedly. I don't remember anything that was said between them. but the next thing that we know, there's a huge gunshot. So he kicked open the door, and I saw my aunt. She was on the ground in the closet, and she had her purse in there with her, and my uncle picked my sister and I up and immediately removed us from the trailer. And my sister hadn't seen anything. I think maybe our uncle closed the door really quickly. Our uncle dropped us off at a neighbor's house nearby and left us alone in a living room. And it was scary, and I didn't, being 7 years old, understand why anybody would want to kill themselves.
Where did you find them to talk to them?
Well, they were in different places because we picked them up at the point where they had entered college, and I should say they both graduated recently. Allison graduated from Smith College, and Catherine graduated from California Polytechnic. Allison is now working for Microsoft, and Catherine is en route to becoming a veterinarian. So they're both doing quite well. But we went to both graduations as well. So we had several different conversations with the two young women. Sometimes at their schools, at where they lived during the graduation week, and in Seattle at one point.
So in the end, I know when I listened to it, they sounded so normal, and that although it was very emotional from time to time, I kept asking, how did they get through this? And did you discover how they got through all this?
Well, there were several ways. I mean, one is that they had each other, and they were the one constant in each other's life, and that was very important to them. The other is that they happened to be in a private foster care facility where there was a social worker who took a very strong interest in them. And so she became a stable force in their life. They both went through years of professional counseling to help them adjust. And they also excelled as students, which gave them a focus, for things even previous to going into foster care when things were so bad at home. They could always find a refuge in their studies.
What did you learn about foster care?
Well, I learned that is not something that you want to stay in. I mean, these girls are exceptional because they managed to age out, is the term, and to do quite well. Most kids who come to foster care, who age out of foster care, end up not finishing school. Certainly most of them don't end up graduating from universities. A huge percentage of them end up in prison. I mean, one of the worst things that can happen in this society, it seems, is to end up spending most of your life in foster care.
So in the end, why do you think they talked to you?
Well, I think they were, first of all, convinced that I was going to tell their story in a way that was fair and that reflected who they were. But secondly, I think that they themselves were justifiably proud of what they had accomplished with their lives, and they were interested in sharing their experiences.
We only had the audio. Was there video of these two?
We have video, but we haven't edited it as a piece yet.
And as they go through their lives, are they doing anything in the way of dealing with others who have these problems?
I think it's too early to say. I mean, they both just graduated, and they're both in the process of sort of securing, their careers at this point. I mean, they certainly have a huge social conscience, and I would be surprised if they don't do something, in that respect at some point.
Did they tell their story to their friends on campus?
That's an interesting part of I think, their background. What I found is that in large measure, no. I mean, when you're in school, when you're in any sort of institution, you're interested in being seen as normal. You're interested in being accepted, And so, for the most part, the first time that people we were talking to really learned about their background was when we approached them and started talking to them. We asked, they said, well, who are some people who are important to you? One of their teachers said, I never knew they came from a background like this. We talked to to Allison's boyfriend. He really wasn't much aware of her background until she finally told him, and also sent a letter explaining her background to his parents, because she just thought it was important to do at some point, but it wasn't something that they initially told people about.
I think I mispronounced her name. How did you pronounce it? Bellew. And how's it spelled?
Bellew.
Oh, E-W. I have O-W. That's what
Yeah.
That was the mistake. So after you look, now we may have time for a couple other clips, but what have you learned about the difference between video, audio, and print?
Well, I'm sure to an old hand like you, this is just as obvious as this night and day. But I learned a few things. I mean, one, of course, is that with video, you have to have pictures. You don't have pictures, you don't have a story. So we were scrambling for various pictures in some cases because some of this stuff was looking back. With audio, with radio in particular, you need sound. I mean, you need, in the refugee camp, for instance, my team spent hours getting sounds of goats and other things from around the camp, sounds that would place you, in that particular environment, which is not all that important, really, when you're doing print. The other thing we learned, one of the documentaries we did out of India, and it was actually a very interesting story that we were going to go with, and it had to do with a group of women in a little village outside of a place called Hyderabad, who had organized themselves and literally built a road to their village, and these were women, who taught themselves how to do this work, and then confronted the men and ended up getting the men to pay them for it. And as a result of building the road, they got infrastructure there, they got electricity there, and many other things to the village. We ultimately decided that that was a story we just couldn't do in radio because no one spoke English, and we did all the interviews via translation, and reviewed all the tapes and said we just cannot put this on air because people will be listening to half an hour of a language they don't understand.
So how have you found your time being spent now that you do this plus your column? How often do you have to write for Newsweek?
I write for Newsweek about 15, 16 times a year. And as you can imagine, audio work, radio work, documentary work is very time consuming. There's lots of tape to review, lots of things to pull together. And probably in the last year, I've spent more of my time doing audio work than I have anything else. This year, I suspect it's going to flip a little bit, devote a bit more time to print. I'm about to start working on a new book as well.
What's that about, the book?
I wrote a book close to 15 years ago now called The Rage of a Privileged Class.
That was actually what you were talking about in that column that I read at the beginning.
Oh, yes, right, yeah. And it was a look at middle-class Black America and why at that juncture so many people were frustrated and so many were angry. We're in a very different era now. We're in an era where obviously Barack Obama is president. We're in an era where many African Americans are running or have run Fortune, not many, but a recognizable number, have run Fortune 500 companies. We have a couple of Black governors. We have a level of achievement that to many people was unimaginable even 15 years ago. And it seems it's time to take another look at that subject, at what's happening with that privileged class today, and what's the meaning of race and class mobility and community in America today. So it'll be a book that looks at that.
Another audio clip, and it's breaking the bonds of tradition, and you talk about something called the Untouchables.
Right.
What's this about? Is this India again?
This is India, and these are the Dalits, otherwise known as the Untouchables, who are the lowest caste grouping in India, and who, even though discrimination has been barred ever since the Constitution was approved in India, still encounter discrimination daily. And it's about, and we focus on the work of a fellow named Martin McWan, who is doing a number of things in India to try to transform the lives of his people, the Dalits.
And they're untouchables in other countries. Explain what they are.
Well, every country that has a caste system, in effect, has a group of people who are untouchables, and these are people, or is equivalent, and these are people who essentially are relegated to doing the worst jobs in a society, are often receive little or no education, are treated routinely, with disrespect. And just in every way are humiliated, and it's here, and it's hereditary. So you're born into it. I mean, you're born into this caste, which you can never escape, even if you change religions. Actually,
is there such a thing as literally an untouchable? They don't touch. others in the?
In the villages, certainly. I mean, in the big cities, it's modified a bit, and the discrimination is not quite as intense. But in the villages, yes. I mean, they literally cannot touch people. I was in a village, not for this documentary, but for another project I was doing a few years back, and went to this small village in India, and the fellow was explaining to me how they were fed by the bosses, and he says, you know, instead of giving us the food, they just throw it at us. One of the seminal experiences that Martin McWan had, who's one of the Dalit leaders, was as a young man, you know, being taught that he could not receive water directly, that he had from a higher caste person, he had to cup his hands and have the water poured into his hands as opposed to touch a cup that they had touched. So yes, it's literally untouchable.
This is about a minute and a half audio clip from this documentary.
Well, my name is Martin McWan. I was born in a small town called Nadiad on 7th August 1959.
Martin was the second oldest of 9 surviving children raised in poverty. But it was not so much the poverty that bothered him as degradation based on caste. His awakening began when he was 6. He was attending Catholic school thanks to the charity of the local priests. But school wasn't exactly free. When his schoolmates were playing ball, he and a few other poor kids were handed brooms.
I never liked to go to school. Every day I used to cry not to go to that school, right?
Because you felt stigmatized.
Because I felt humiliated, stigmatized, and hurt.
When he was 9, working on a farm with his grandmother, his throat was parched and he asked for water. Instead of giving him a glass, the farmer told him to catch the water in his hands.
So my grandmother taught me that you have to fold your hands like this, right?
Martin was learning an essential lesson, how to interact with people without touching them, how to be untouchable. Mahatma Gandhi called untouchables Harijans, children of God. The Constitution calls them scheduled castes and guarantees them equality. Their own leadership calls them Dalits, which means broken or oppressed. They make up roughly 20% of India's population. And as many Hindus see it, they are condemned to suffer for sins committed in a previous life.
I guess I could ask the question, how can it be called a democracy when 20% of the people are known to be untouchables?
Well, it's a very sensitive issue with the Indian government. The Indian government insists that they are treated fairly. They have had their own version of affirmative action in India, and as I said, in the large cities, the discrimination is not nearly as visible or as oppressive as it is in the small villages.
Can you get completely out of that and never have to admit to anybody that you're an untouchable?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. I mean, you can change religions. A lot of Dalits convert out of Hinduism. They convert to Christianity, as Martin has done, or they convert to Islam. But they're still identified within their society as people from this lower caste. There's a woman who's actually taken over leadership of the organization that Martin founded, an organization called Navsajan, called Manjula Pradeep, whose father initially never told them that they were untouchables, and actually changed their name so that people wouldn't necessarily associate them with untouchability. But then when she went around relatives, they of course told her, and the father made the mistake of giving her a name, or giving the family a name, which is a very uncommon name as a last name in India. So people just raised questions as to where do you come from, who are you? And it really didn't work. And she ultimately embraced that identity and decided she needed to change the way society treats people.
Put this into context, it's about 220 million people based on the population of 1.1 billion people. Can you tell who the untouchables are when you see them?
No. I mean, there's no identifying physical characteristic that will label somebody untouchable. It's really a question of the name and knowing where they came from and who they are. I mean, and certainly it's possible, if one wants to recreate an identity, in the same way, I suppose, in the United States, we used to talk of passing at one point, where people who were African American but a very light complexion could just vanish into the white world. I mean, it's possible theoretically, but that means in the context of your life, cutting yourself off from your family, cutting yourself off from your history, and becoming someone else.
Let's go back to the beginning. How much education do you have?
I have a master's degree in science and technology, and also done other graduate studies as well.
And where did you get those?
George Washington University in Washington.
In Washington. And where do you live now?
Upper West Side in New York City, Manhattan.
Not too far from here.
Right.
We're on the east side. And how about a family? Do you have children?
One daughter, Elisa Maria, who's 6, and a wife who's an attorney, who's actually works in the Attorney General's office as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs.
I can't get out of my head Mrs. Klinger and Gwendolyn Brooks. What do you think would have happened if Mrs. Klinger hadn't recognized your talent and Gwendolyn Brooks hadn't tried to do something about it?
I mean, I think I would have done okay. I mean, I had already proven that I tested well. I was already in a very good school. I was on a track to succeed one way or another. And I think like a lot of people, like myself, people who come from very modest beginnings and do reasonably well in life, there were lots of people who helped me along the way. I mean, another very important mentor of mine was Jim Hogue, who's now the editor of Foreign Affairs. He was the editor of the Chicago Sun-Times when I came along as an 18-year-old would-be columnist, and actually made me into a columnist. I had to wait till I was 19 to become one at the newspaper. But there are a few editors of big city newspapers who would have taken a 19-year-old kid and said, we're going to give you a column on the op-ed page.
Do you mentor others?
I've worked with others sort of throughout my life. I mean, at one point I ran a program, for that trained journalists that was based at UC Berkeley. And I don't like the term mentor because it sort of implies you're this wise person giving wisdom to a lot of other young people. But I certainly help people when I can.
And telling others, somebody listening to this, they see you're doing audio and video and print and books and all that stuff. What advice do you give somebody? How do you discover whether or not you can really write or not, really have this talent?
I think you only discover it by doing it, by testing yourself, by sending things out. I mean, sometimes people will ask me if I will read their manuscripts, and I will often say, if I have time, sure, I'll do it, but you don't want me to read it. You'll send it to an agent. If it's any good, the agent will tell you that, and they'll get back to you on it. I'm not gonna publish your book, but you only find that out by testing yourself.
So where do you get the most feedback from now that you're doing all this different media work?
A lot of different places. I mean, and Newsweek is obviously a huge publication. Get a lot of feedback from Newsweek readers. I've become well enough known to at least certain readers that they look for my things. They look for me on the web. So I get a lot of traffic onto my website at this point from people who want to alert me to something or tell me about something.
So Newsweek has changed. I don't want to necessarily use the word dramatically, but it's a different magazine than it used to be. You're going from a 3 million circulation down to a 1.5 million circulation, and it's become, I guess some people have said it's more like The Economist than the old Newsweek. What's your take on it, and what do you notice the difference to be?
Obviously, Brian, every print publication is having to recreate itself in light of the economic situation now, and in light of the internet and the changes that is forced on people. And I think Newsweek is no different. The idea of a mass news magazine seems to not appeal to as many people. Certainly doesn't appeal to as many advertisers as it once did. So Newsweek has made the decision. It's made the decision to go in the direction of trying to tell fewer stories, but tell them more in depth. It's more of a focus on commentary now than it used to do. They're trying to make it visually more attractive. Will it ultimately end up being the salvation of Newsweek? I don't think anybody knows. I think we're all looking for a model that works these days, but it seems to me to make as much sense as anything.
So we can find all this audio and video on elliscose.com.
elliscose.com, correct.
And what's the future for your audio documentaries? When's the next one coming up, and where can people hear it?
We haven't figured that out yet. I mean, right now I'm focusing on getting some print things in order, and then we'll take a look at the audio schedule. Ideally, we'll get some stuff out next year, but we just haven't put ourselves on the schedule yet for that.
And given what's happened in the economy, are you having any problems with funding?
We haven't gone into fundraising mode yet. I've talked to some of my funders who said that they would be happy to be involved again. Some are not so sure. So if we have this conversation in 6 months, I have a better answer for you on that one.
Ellis Cose, thank you very much.
Brian, it's a pleasure chatting with you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.